Hello again. This is a continuation of our discussion of social groups in sociology class. So today we're going to look at the different types of groups, different types of social groups that make up social structure, the components of social structure. Okay, and so the connection that these two groups have to social structure has to do with socialization. So these two group types have very simple names. One of them is called primary, which means first, and the other one's called secondary, which means second. And the reason these are named primary and secondary has to do with their connection to the socialization process for individuals. Does that type of group and the group membership, the kind of interaction that happens, the length of time you spend with those people, does that particular type of formula mean that it has a strong impact on your socialization process? Or does the particular type of formula that particular social group has, is it less impactful for your socialization process? And so primary, those are the ones that are the most impactful for an individual's socialization process, and secondary, those are the ones that are less so. Okay? And so that's how we categorize these two different types of social groups that you'll read about in chapter 4. So, you already have the definition of a social group or the components necessary for a good definition of social groups from the previous lecture. So please remember that those general categorizations or those general components of social groups that I gave you in the previous lecture are components of primary and secondary groups. But the way we distinguish which is which has to do with going deeper into those components. So in the social groups discussion, the general social groups discussion, I told you that it just needs to be two or more people, right? Well, when we look at the distinction between primary or secondary groups, we go deeper into, well, just how many people does it have to be? And the answer for primary groups is that they tend to be small-ish. They tend to be closer to the 2 number or closer to the single digits of members in primary groups rather than double digits of members. So secondary groups tend to be large-ish. I don't know if large-ish, you can spell it as one word, but whatever. I don't know how the captioning is going to do it in YouTube. But primary groups tend to be toward the small-ish side of social group numbers, whereas secondary groups tend to be large-ish in their numbers, okay? There's not a definite number to put on it, but as far as being impactful for your socialization process or for an individual socialization process, the fewer the number of people in the groups, the more intense the interaction with those particular people can be, and therefore the deeper the learning can be from that social interaction that you have with those individuals, okay? And so that on the flip side, the more folks who are in a group with you, the fewer one-on-one or intense interaction that you're going to have, or the less intense the interaction is going to be with each individual member. And so you're probably not going to have a whole lot of long-lasting, deep behavioral patterns or mannerisms or likes and dislikes or political philosophies and that kind of stuff from those members of that secondary group. Less likely. Okay, not impossible, but less likely. Okay, so also the social bond that you have with people is important in determining a social group. And so with a primary group, what I meant was social identity. I think I said social bond. What I mean is social identity here. You tend to have a personal or an intimate type of identity that is connected to these people in your primary groups. Your best friend is not merely a friend, not merely a classmate, but they are your best friend. You have a personal, maybe even intimate association with them. That characterizes the kind of communication that you have. You know, for the periodic communication or social interaction that we were talking about in the previous lecture, the kind of social interaction that you have can be more intimate, more personal, probably is more intimate, more personal. That doesn't mean that you don't also have, you know, regular run-of-the-mill things like my husband will call me on the way home from work and say, do you need me to stop at the store? Like, that's not necessarily an intimate thing. However, my next door neighbor doesn't do that, and he drives past a lot of stores too, right? So even though you might on the face of it not recognize the communication as being something personal or intimate, you know, zooming out out and looking at it with a more objective lens can sometimes give you some insight into the kind of relationship that a person has with another person and the intimate nature of their social identity that's linked to each other. On the flip side, in a secondary group, the social identity tends to be business-like. The kind of communication that goes on within secondary groups tends to be business-like. So for instance, this class that we have together is a secondary group, okay? We are going to have, we'll look at it again with some of these others, but we're not together for the long haul. That's not the idea of teacher and student. Student moves on, right? Your role as student that's linked with that status as student is that you move on after you're finished with not just my class, but the school in general. So the kind of interaction that we have is business-like. The reason you're watching me on YouTube today, is not because I'm going to be some kind of social influencer or trying to be. It's because you are supposed to take notes on this. I'm going to give you a test. You better be studying, and you have to write a reaction paper, and you have to do a quiz, and there's projects. You have to do this, and that's why the interaction is happening. If friendliness is part of our business-like relationship, that's great, right? That makes our business-like relationship easier to take for the time that we are interacting with each other, right? So friendliness can be part of this. Sharing some personal stories, like if my cat photobombs one of the lecture, picking him up the other day. I think that was in my gender studies class when that happened, but when I was making a video. But introducing you to my pets, for instance, might just be something that builds the community that we need in order to get through this class successfully together, right? So business-like social identity, business-like communication patterns, the bonds that you tend to have with secondary group members are instrumental bonds. Now, this is a particular vocabulary word that you can get from, this might be in chapter 5 instead of chapter 4, but I think it's in chapter 4. Instrumental bonds, these are goal-oriented bonds. So again, using our class as an example, we have the goal of successfully completing this semester together and therefore making you able to successfully complete future classes because of the foundational knowledge that you got with me. So there's a goal to the bond that we have together, the teacher-student bond. Also, as we talked about already, in this particular secondary group that we're using as an example, our class together, we have a temporary bond, okay? It's temporary or maybe only periodic. So most of my students, I have a temporary bond for the semester with them. Often, I hear from students after they've had my class and they say, hey, I'm going to pharmacy school, I'm applying for this scholarship, I'm doing whatever. You were influential in this way, can you write me a recommendation? So there's still, even though, something stood out about the business-like relationship that we had together, that's still only temporary or periodic that I will hear from you for the whole rest of your life, basically. But that's the nature of the business that we are doing together, right? So this is a secondary group. Instrumental bonds, make sure you write down the definition of that in your notes. I haven't written it on the board for you here, but it's a goal-oriented bond where you're working towards some kind of goal, and that's different than the primary groups over here. So in your primary groups, it's smallish, you know that the kind of communication that you have is personal and intimate usually, and the bonds that we have is not goal-oriented. The bonds in a primary group are emotionally oriented. They are usually, the bonds are linked through love, through mutual respect, through kinship. There's a word I love to throw out there, but it's an anthropology kind of term. These are expressive bonds where we have a different thing linking us together, a more concrete thing, a more long-lasting thing that links us together. We're not merely roommates, we are cousins. So maybe we don't live together later on, we are still going to have that regular interaction because of that kind of that kind of bond that we have between us. And also, primary groups tend to be long-term, not like secondary groups over here. It's not just a temporary thing. It's not just a periodic thing where it's once a week. And periodic over here can mean once a week for your whole life. Like, I go to a church where I have been a member of that church since I was 14, y'all. And this gray hair is real, so that's a long time. But I am there once a week. And do I have friends that I have made in that church? Yes. But that secondary group brought about the friendship, so those individuals within that group community, or we even use the word church family, have become primary to me. I'm the godmother of some children who have been born in that church, for instance. There is a different bond that comes from the associations that we make in secondary groups. Almost all of our primary groups that we develop after we are born into the family unit that we're born or adopted into, almost all of the primary groups that we develop throughout the rest of our lives come from our association in secondary groups first. I've met a really good lifelong friend from being a co-worker with her. There were 6-8 people in our office. We were all part of a secondary group called Co-workers. She and I developed a primary group membership, and we chat all the time, and we go out for chocolatinis, and we do all kinds of stuff. So yes, there are primary groups that we get from secondary group memberships, but the primary groups are longer lasting than the secondary groups. Neither me nor my friend who we used to be co-workers, neither of us work at the same place anymore. And neither of us are in contact with anybody from that place way back then except each other. So that primary group came from that secondary group membership that was temporary, and we worked together in a business-like, friendly environment. That was part of the secondary group. But I keep on emphasizing the friendliness here because for introductory sociology students, I regularly see misunderstanding in your reaction papers if you write about this topic, because so many secondary groups have sometimes, on the surface, it seems like they have like really personal and intimate kind of bonds associated with secondary groups. Often people will argue that, like my example of church that I just gave a minute ago, because we do call it church family, a lot of times people will argue, no, the church in general, like the whole congregation. Like, you know, there's 150 people that go to my church and the whole congregation, we are one big family. No, we're really not. And we're going to look more deeply into that when we look at some of the things that I mentioned in the little outline thing that I gave you in your week 6 folder, when we're going to look at dramaturgical analysis of social life and the looking glass self and significant others. We're going to look at and examine really the way that we interact with people, whether, you know, and the difference in that interaction type when we have personal and intimate relations with each other, or whether we have business-like, goal-oriented relations with each other. There's a big difference, and I think you probably know by now that probably the cashier in Kroger, when you're checking out, that asks you, did you find everything okay? Is, you know, how are you doing? And you'll probably be really, really polite and say at least fine, thank you, even if you ignore them for the rest of the time. You'll probably be polite and nice with that cashier who you don't know very well. And then you get home, and if you are actually pretty grumpy, you're going to unload on those folks. At least, you know, that's the pattern that a lot of people follow. And so we're going to look at that, the holdback, the way that we kind of hold back some of our actual thoughts and impulses from secondary group memberships. And it's not until we have more private, personal relationships with people before we kind of show sometimes Irving Goffman called it our backstage self. So we'll look at that more in depth. It's very interesting as we get into this micro level part of social structure. But please remember that all of these things are linked back to socialization, right? Go back to week 5 to that very first lecture that we had together about the agents of socialization, and then we went to the social institutions, and then we went to social structure. All of this is coming full circle, okay? So all of this is intertwined and linked up, and, you know, think of a pretzel. It's all in there. Okay, so there'll be 2 or 3 more videos this week, and please text me with questions. I look forward to your reaction papers. Bye.